Hello, everyone.
I'm Karl,
And I'm
and
Em.
welcome to our podcast discussing all of the latest books. This is our 21st episode, and we will be discussing Beach Read by Emily Henry. We will be saving our ratings until the very end.
We promise to give you all of our honest opinions on all the characters, chapters, and scenarios. We don't mean any harm to any of the authors. This is solely our opinion. And as always, we promise to call them like we read them.
Period. So, for trigger warnings, there is references to a cult, death, manipulation, abuse, depression,
Cheating, divorce,
yeah, cancer, anything else?
serious drinking in a couple scenes. Some pretty large drinking habits a couple times.
Okay. So, as always, take care of yourself, and spoilers will lie ahead.
If you don't want to hear how this book ends, please pause here, go read it, and then come back to this episode. It is also on Audible as well if you want to listen to it. Are you ready to get started?
Let's get into it. So, I'm going to read the blurb on the back of the book just to give you a reminder of what the book is about. Augustus Everett is an acclaimed author of literary fiction. January Andrews writes best-selling romance. When she pens A Happily Ever After, he kills off his entire cast. They're polar opposites. In fact, the only thing they have in common is that for the next 3 months they're living in neighboring beach houses, broke and bogged down with writer's block. Then one hazy evening, one thing leads to another, and they strike a deal designed to force them out of their creative ruts. Augustus will spend the summer writing something happy, and January will pen the next great American novel. She'll take him on field trips worthy of any rom-com montage, and he'll take her to interview surviving members of a backwoods death cult, obviously. Everyone will finish a book, and no one will fall in love. Really.
Our blurbs are a little close to what our summaries are, so I'm just going to go straight into our summary. January is traveling to a beach house that her dad left to her after he had passed. Turns out it was a house that he lived in with his mistress. Her mother is refusing to speak about the situation for any kind of clarity, and she expressed she's struggling with finding out about the mistress with writing love stories for her books. Her ex broke up with her because she's depressed, and he wanted a fun, adventurous significant other. As she's going to get coffee, she runs into her arch nemesis Gus, and she's invited to a book club by the coffee bookstore owner, in which she gets drunk at, and Gus takes her home. Gus comes up with the idea that they write opposing genres, and whoever sells their book first writes a review. They also start doing researching on the weekends for those genres. So, starting out, I want to talk about how she ended up finding out about this mistress at the funeral. It was very, very like I could not imagine going into the funeral. Obviously, my dad just
Yeah.
died. And then all of a sudden this random woman walks up to me and like hands me a letter and a key and was just like, "Here you go," you know. I mean,
I thought that was so I gotta be honest. So later on in the book, she doesn't seem like that bad of a person, but because that's how we started out, she was like this. I mean, I hated her from the get go. I was like, why would you come up
yeah.
to his funeral and do this ever in a million years?
It's almost like rubbing it in. Like in this moment, I was literally like, you're literally rubbing it in the face of her mother, his family, like
Yes.
all of the stuff that you were like the side piece. And then not only that, but you're handing her a key and a letter, almost like the last words he had was with you
Yes.
and not them kind of situation.
What a sleazy little bad word,
Mhm.
because I was like, I would punch you in your face if you walked up to my husband's funeral and did that, or my dad's funeral. I would have lost my mind. I
Mhm.
just thought, like, I kind of thought that really spoke about her character. And I get in theory, she probably thought that was the only time she would have the opportunity, but she also could have waited till they were like outside after the funeral, or, you know what I mean? Like, there were other time periods,
Yeah.
even at the funeral, that we could have done this and it would have been not as awful. I, I hated her from that get go. I was like, no, I hate you.
Well, and the other thing too is that I really did not like is we never got an understanding of how the mother found out about Sonya in the first place. And so I was just
Yeah.
like, so she knew who she was. but and I mean, my thing is if they didn't know of each other the entire time, like how did she know what she looked like? How did she know that that was her?
Oh, no,
Like,
she knew
it
about
was
her,
just
and she
like,
knew who she was. That's what got me, like, it's one thing to know your husband's having an affair, but she actually knew who he was
yeah,
having an affair with.
yeah. And I mean, we never got that clarity, so I was kind of bothered by that because I was hoping, like, whenever she, especially like towards the end when she calls her mom and like explains everything with her ex, I was kind of hoping for that follow up story of, hey, this is how it happened. Which, I mean, Dad sort of pinpointed on kind of like their relationship, and Sonia kind of did towards
The
the end,
letters from
but it really
Dad really
wasn't.
kinda clarified, but it still wasn't
Yeah,
fully clarified.
like the mom's perspective of it for
Yeah,
sure.
and yes, so, like, I don't know. I hated her from the get-go. I also was kind of mad at Mom for not telling January at some point, like, when she was an adult even,
Mhm.
or preparing her for the possibility that her dad's mistress was gonna show up at his funeral or something along those lines. I get why Mom would wanna keep it a secret because like, it hurts her, but it also kinda made me hate Dad too. Like, throughout the whole book, she sets him up as, like, this great dad, and for me, it's
Mhm.
like you can't possibly be a great dad and also be a horrible husband. You can in reality, but like it for me, I felt like I was January and I was like, you can't do
Yeah.
both. Like you have to pick one or the other. And so she really took us on that journey though, because by the time we got to dad's letters, I was gone. But it was cool how we started out sort of like hating him and hating Sonia and then getting that storyline, which I'm sure was the entire point. And in reality, that's how life is. You know, you may judge somebody based on one thing they did and then realize slowly, like, oh, I actually might have liked them if I hadn't had that first bad impression kind of thing.
So we do get where whenever January arrives at the house, she's kind of going through it and she chooses to avoid certain rooms and stuff because she's afraid of what she may find behind the
Okay, that
room.
was my favorite thing in the whole
Um,
book. I just have to add this really quickly that she was afraid she was going to find a sex dungeon. I was like, I
yeah.
hope she does. That would just be hilarious. Can you imagine? I would cannot.
Well, and whenever she gets there and she sees the basement and then she sees like their master, which she honestly doesn't know which one is their master bedroom, but I would think that if my dad was with a mistress, she would have cleaned out the house like she did of any kind of articles that were important to
Yeah, like
her
their
if she's handing
picture
over the key.
in the bathroom or something. Like, take
Yeah.
that out.
Yeah, which I think that was really the only thing I think she mentioned that was like an identifying factor to that relationship was that
That
picture. But
specifically,
I feel
but
like maybe Sonia left
maybe. She also talks
on
about she
purpose.
could tell, like, that the certain furniture had to have been picked out by Sonia because her dad wouldn't have picked it out or things like that, which then made her
Yeah.
question, like, "Do I even really know my dad then? Because maybe he did pick it out." But I think it was just I think you're right. It was just that one picture that was actually, like, them together for sure.
Yeah. Like the rest of it obviously was picked out by one or the other, but I there wasn't like, pictures lining the house or like items that specifically like a shawl or, a piece of clothing that was hanging in the closets
Yes.
that were Sonia's or her dad's or anything like that. If there was, they didn't point anything out that I remember,
Yes.
besides that one
Did it
picture.
make you really sad,
So I
though, to know, like, that her dad had things of hers in this house with his mistress? I feel like and this may be the naive point of view, but, like, I would almost assume you would keep both parts of your life separate entirely. You wouldn't wanna
Mhm.
mix them, because I imagine if you mixed them, you'd feel guilty constantly when you walk around and see your daughter's
Yeah.
books with your mistress. Like, so that actually really bothered me that dad had those sort of things in this house where his mistress primarily resided. Like, it was crazy. I was like, I hated him, honestly. At the beginning, I hated dad.
So I personally felt like he was almost so comfortable with the situation that he had gotten into a sense of like, "Oh, I'm not gonna get caught," kind of like attitude. So it was just like a comfortability with that kind of aspect of
I
it
think he,
is what I thought
I was
it
going to say,
was.
and not necessarily get caught because he did get caught, but I think
Mhm.
because mom was never going to leave him because of it, and he knew he was going to continue to do it anyways. Like, I think he just accepted that's how life was gonna be. But
Yeah,
that also I
possibly.
don't like that.
Yeah.
If I guess because I have been cheated on, so, like, the thought of you accepting that it's okay to continue to cheat on me just because I know about it now, and we have a daughter
Mhm.
together, like, even, like, I did not like dad at the beginning, and I'm not gonna say I liked him at the end either, but we sort of get, again, a bad first impression, and then we learn a little bit more about dad that kind of it's a little bit better. You don't hate him as much, but I still not a fan. Still disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially because I mean, her whole life up to that point had literally been like made on this epic love
Yes.
story and this epic, relationship, which is even crazier to me that she only remembers like one time that her parents were like separated, and then after that she remembers them like laughing, holding
Yeah.
hands in the car, like dancing in the kitchen. Like there was never those times that she remember, like I vaguely but very profoundly in some cases remember when my parents were not together or arguing or things like that. So like I
Yeah.
don't I don't understand how that wouldn't, which I
I
mean,
guess because her
I
mom just
guess in the
accepted it. Like,
it's possible. I think because in my situation, like my parents were actively trying to get a divorce, and so like I watched them go through those arguments and things like that, and she thought they were happy that whole time, so she didn't mark any of those memories as significant if that was the case, because,
that makes
that's
sense.
that was my only justification for it, because I knew that my parents were separating, so I notated all those points where she did not know any of that was happening besides that one time they split up. So,
That's fair. I will say too, like again, when we found out that mom had cancer and he's like still was cheating on her, I hated him. Like I
mhm,
hated him with every fiber of my being. I was so mad. Which at
mm,
the end it sort of clarifies that they're like it wasn't consistently cheating on her every single time. Like it would go
yeah.
periods for months that he would not reach out and things like that. Which doesn't make it better, but it at least in my mind at first I thought he was consistently like had a whole other woman for years and no break. So I was thinking like
Well, at the beginning for sure,
your
yeah.
wife has cancer and you're over here sleeping with somebody else like the entire time, especially when she gets it again, you're still doing that. Like that really got me. But then we get clarification at the end that's not really what happened. But
So let me ask you this. Do you believe it's possible to be that deep in love with two different
no,
people?
I do
I
not.
agree.
I think you can have love for somebody, but to be in love with somebody and committed, I don't think you can have that with two different people. I don't think he actually loved Sonia. I think everything that happened with mom, he was looking for someone to comfort him, take his side, be there for him because he had been the rock for mom for so long, it sounds like, that that's really what it was. It was more of like a comfort thing and like benefited me, but I don't think he really loved her. I think if he really loved Sonia, him and mom would have split and he would have been, remarried with Sonia and they would have had a life together. And I think Sonia
I agree.
kind of points that out at the end. Then she's like, when we ended it, I went and found someone else who did love me and who would choose me while your dad didn't. And like I get like nothing to your dad, but your dad did really love your mom. Like we kind of get that from her point of view even too. So, but I do not think you can love
I
the same people.
personally
I mean, I don't think you can love two people the same amount. No.
I personally think that the love of Sonya was a familiar love. So it was something that he like whenever during like term, because I mean they said that I think it was their 14 or 15 when they
Hmm.
first started dating. So I think it was one of those loves that she was with him during some of their his biggest times in his life and things like that. And so I think it was like a familiar love that he had like a comfort
Hmm.
with, and so it was just easy to go back into that because of that comfort that they had during his times of struggle. But I still find it pretty crappy that you would abandon somebody that you claim that you're, love, especially the way in his letters he starts talking about how in love he is with January and her mother and stuff like that, and then just to kind of be like, oh yeah, I just like slept with a woman, too bad, so
Well, to be
sad.
quite frank, again, like, so I hated Sonia at the beginning because of how she handled it. By the time we got to the end, and I don't want to say like I could identify with her, but I could identify with the fact like she loves someone who continues to not choose her and continues to hurt her by not, treating her the way she should be treated. Like I kind of sympathize with her, I guess, to the point that I was like, well, what you were doing was wrong and you knew what you were doing was wrong. However,
Yeah.
like you also deserve to be treated better than that. So like dad really did both of
Hmm.
you dirty and y'all still just out here loving this man and giving him credit like he's a great guy. It was kind of crazy. But like
Yeah.
that's real life also. So that's what I really liked about this book is that we did start with like this idea like life's a fairy tale and it's romance everything, and she was coming to the realization that like no, not everything is a fairy tale and life is real and you have to go through bad things to get to good things sometimes and whatnot. And sort of like the way you can accept that but also then still decide to romance life even after was really cool to see that. So that was like my favorite part of this entire storyline, not even necessarily their love. It was like more of the acceptance of like bad things happen, but like you can look for the good still. I really like that part.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I did not, until you just put it into words like that, I did not think about it that way. But I mean, she does kind of say something like that towards the end whenever Gus was talking to her. But I mean, I didn't like put that into the flow of the story until you just said it like that. But yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, that was my main takeaway because I felt like we had moments where we weren't sure if Gus really wanted January, but really in the grand scheme of things, like it was never a doubt in my mind they were going to end up together. I don't feel like we
Hmm.
really fully had that. I don't know. So
Which we talked about outside of this whole shabam, that we thought that it would have been very good to have Gus's point of view,
yes,
to kind of get like, because I do feel like it was very her hating him, and then it was very him kind of hating on her, which I mean, in January's
correct.
perspective, she thought that's what was happening, and then them love each other at the end. So it was very much like a three-part kind of shabam. But at the same time, like, if we go to Gus's point of view, he would have been like falling in love with her the entire time, or already in love with
Yes,
her, and it would have kind of been like that like opposing kind of situation. And I do think, since we were doing opposing genres and opposing stuff, that would have played further into that
I agree.
theme. But unfortunately, like, we didn't get that. So I mean, that was one of the faults we did have with this book, was not that opposing thing. Which, honestly, authors, if you would like to run your ideas by us, I mean, we've got some good extra things to just add a little flavor to it.
No,
Just throwing it out there.
wholeheartedly. Like we both said, like it was a good book, but like this would have made it so much better. And I think like if we'd had
Mhm.
Gus's point of view, it actually would have helped us like Gus better. Because in January's point of view,
Yes.
we get such negative pictures of Gus. And not necessarily on purpose. It's sort of like the phase she is in life. Like everything is awful right now. But if we had gotten Gus's side to know he didn't actually hate her, because there were scenes and moments that I thought, oh, this is going to be a really cute, like little romantic scene. We're building up their love.
Mhm.
And then he was, like, awful, and I was like, "Oh, maybe I
Yeah.
don't want her to be with him." That kinda thought. Like, instead of, like, "Oh, no, like, he's lying because he secretly loves you and he just wanna hurt you." You know what I mean? Like, we didn't really get that side of the story. So his point of view would have been chef's kiss. That would have been so much it would have been so good.
Well, and to be honest, like, I really think, fixing to go into the scene where they were on the back porches when she first arrived, and she's like, upset about the party going on. I really think that that scene in general would have set up such a, like, a goosebumpy kind of like feeling, if we go would have immediately after she goes out on the deck to like gripe and complain about all this, and then he's sitting there and we go into his point of view and he looks over and realizes it's January, the girl he's been in love with for years,
Yes.
like, just so happens to be there. I just, like, I even talking about it just gives me goosebumps, because I just feel like it would have been like such a, like, a good deep connection moment that we did not get in the book.
I agree.
So, but like I said, we do get where, whenever January is woken up by a party, she goes out onto the deck and looks over and she realizes it's Gus.
I
And,
don't think she realized
well,
it was
I
Gus at
don't
that
think,
point
no,
yet, did she?
no, 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 that was the
He
next day in
was he
the
was
bookstore.
shrouded in darkness. It was so dramatic.
Yeah. But she basically like says, hey, can you turn it down or whatever, and he goes inside and tells everybody to go home. And so
Realized
she
later
does
that
end
was
up,
his birthday, though. Like
yes. Yeah, the connection there, which at first I thought it was setting up that she was going to be so bothered, and throughout the whole book, by this party house that's going on next door, that she was going to go into town maybe and run across somebody. And so I thought that was what it was setting it up for. But I loved it even more to know that the person next door, especially when we get those little Taylor Swift
mhm.
scenes going on, like, I just loved that.
Yes, me too.
But she gets massively drunk whenever she gets woken up, and decides to just basically down a whole entire bottle of wine. And she goes into town the next day to get some coffee to kind of recover from her hangover. And she ends up at this little coffee shop bookstore combo called
I
Pete's.
love
And
Pete. If Pete hadn't been in this story, I don't know that I would have loved this book as much.
yeah, I definitely agree. She added just an extra oomph to the story that I
Yeah.
just And then like the little cute little like setups that she did and stuff like that was just adorable. I
Yes.
just
I
loved
don't
it.
know that they would have fallen in love if Pete hadn't been in this story, honestly. She was from the beginning, like, pushing them together, I feel like.
Which, I mean, we do end up realizing that, she is Gus's
Mhm.
aunt. So she, I'm sure, heard, which I think he did say at some point, like, she heard all of my stories about you growing up and instantly she knew who you were, which is just kind of crazy that she, like, didn't have her books or something in the store already. Kind of, I would have thought that if
Did she know
that
who
was
she
like,
was?
if she knew of, I think he says something along that lines.
Her in college. So, like, it would have only been his college days that he talked about her.
I mean, Kayla knew who she was, so I would assume because I mean he seemed to be pretty close with his aunt telling him everything based off of how she was saying stuff to January. So I would assume he at least talked about her to some extent. I mean, she may not have known that was the January he was talking about, but I mean, how many Januaries do you know, to be
Yeah, the
honest?
name
So,
kinda well, and
yeah.
I don't remember if she says anything specific, but if she did, I do agree, like, why would you not have her books in your store? At least
Yeah.
one.
Because I'm sure he mentioned she was a writer, at least.
Something.
And then as soon as she, like, I feel like there would have been some dots connected as soon as she come in and she's like, yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any of my books. And then January is a pretty unique name.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like the trails have been like, I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but I think this is that January we're talking about here. So pretty quickly after that, I mean, Gus walks in the door and she realizes that Gus is the Augustus that was her arch nemesis in college. Which honestly, the arch nemesis kind of tagline was kind of, I don't know. I just feel like it was overplayed for a majority of the book. I feel like it really wasn't a love story until about the last like 100-ish pages.
This.
I
I
really,
think, like, the goal was, like, a rivals to lovers setup, but he
mhm,
never saw her as a rival, so it didn't really
yeah,
work, and so it was more almost like an enemies to lover, but only, like, a one-way road that way. So it was just kinda weird. It didn't quite fit
yeah,
a trope that we were familiar with, I guess.
yes. I don't know if any one-sided tropes that literally it's a one-sided situation until like the last
I mean,
chapter.
and we've read, like, where it's, like, enemies to lover, but he's secretly in love with her. But normally we get
Mhm.
his point of view or, like, a big scene to where, like, it's a big expose that we realize that. And that this was more of, like, a slow burn, but, like, she thinks he hates her, she hates him.
Yeah.
You know, it was just weird. I don't know, it didn't quite fit one trope, so it was hard to, like, kinda place
I
it and
don't
follow along.
I would actually disagree that it was even a slow burn because I mean literally it was just like one scene where he whispers in her ear that he's read her books before and she's like, "Oh, okay." And then next thing you know it's like 30 chapters later and then he's like, "Oh, I liked you before the party." And she's like, "Oh, there's another part." It was just like random spots. It
That's
wasn't
fair.
even like little flirtations that happened here and there or anything like that. Like it just happened and then it didn't happen and then it happened and then it didn't happen
Well, and
kind
like
of
we
thing.
talked about earlier, again, I think that there were some scenes that were supposed to be like little flirtations, but we get only her point of view, and she's looking at it negative and thinks he hates her, and she's like, "What are we doing?" So then it kind
Yeah.
of ruins that flirtation moment because you're like, "Is it supposed to be flirty or what's happening?" Because it's confusing. So I think that might be why.
I would agree with that because he does say that he like handed her pencils to try to get her to talk to him, like in or asked her for pencils or whatever in
Yeah.
college. So I mean, I do get where maybe he's just maybe awkward at making it
Well, and like she
obvious,
would come
or she just really thinks that he's hate her so badly that it's just like stupid
Well, and, like, for
stuff.
example of that also is, like, he would only critique her writing, and it wasn't because he hated her, it was because she was so good, and he wanted her to be even better. Like, it wasn't so, like, we have
Yeah,
a skewed point of view in all of those moments, and so we don't realize at the very end that, oh, like, he's, like, been in love with you since you were in college. And we're like, "Wait, what? He
yeah.
was?" It's just confusing.
All right. So, whenever Pete invites her to the book club, she ends up showing up with a bottle of wine in her purse and she is greeting everybody and all of a sudden like the crowd parts and there's Sonia sitting on the couch and she runs to the bathroom completely trying to talk herself into staying, downing a bottle of wine while she's in the
I love the
bathroom.
purse wine.
And yes. Especially when she offers it to Gus. I laughed so hard. I was like, because I think he showed up thinking that they were going to talk about his
Mhm.
book.
Oh, he
And
definitely
then
did.
he's like, yeah, he's just like baffled that they're not, which granted, probably Pete did tell him, like, hey, we've decided to do your book. Do you mind being like a guest to our, book club or, something like that? Or
Well, or to insinuate
I
that
don't
he
know.
is going to be, like, the guest and it not be one of his books is hilarious. I loved it.
Well, especially because I think he even says at some point, like, this was the first book club I was ever invited to. And so you would automatically assume that, oh, I'm invited to this book club as the
Mhm.
guest because my book is being talked about when I'm a writer.
That was one of my
But
favorite things in this entire book is when they're both sitting there and realizing that these ladies have this red, white, and blue, or whatever it was called, book club, and what it stands for is the fact that they read like communist spy books. I thought that was so funny,
uh
like not what you would picture like these little old ladies be reading either. It was hilarious. I love that.
Well, and they're like they're little it was almost like a moment where I mean, this is how I read it, so take it with a grain of salt, but whenever they looked at each other and they chuckled because almost like where they were trying to hold in their laugh and then it escapes or whatever that oh my gosh, we both are stupid going into this thinking it's one thing because it almost seemed like January could read his mind of like, oh wait, this is not my book, like what in the world's happening kind of
Yeah.
situation. So I really enjoyed that. And then also for the fact that I did respect a little bit Sonya when she left the book club because January was feeling uncomfortable. It was almost like she's new to town, whatever. But at the same time, my other question is how in the world did all of these ladies and this town, because it doesn't seem like it's a very large town, not know about Sonya and January's dad?
That's my thing. At least Pete. Like how Pete specifically, who this is Sonya's friend, and probably has met January's dad, has seen them out in public. Like, did they know and just not think it was appropriate to comment on it? Or did they not put it together that that was January's dad? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
at this point, I mean, she's remarried. So she found someone else and she's been with someone else for some time. So maybe they just didn't connect the dots that that's who that could be. But also, like, you had to have known that was his house and now she's in that house. I mean, I guess you could just, think she might have bought it from somebody, but I don't know. That seemed weird to me. I feel like that should have been more clarified.
Yeah,
Explanation.
I completely agree. Which I mean, Sonya does says she's married now, so maybe the last time they were together was quite some time ago, and so
Maybe.
they just like they didn't think it was the same situation. I don't know. But then also like was Sonya not living in this beach house or have like her name on the beach house? Like,
Yeah.
now
I don't
there's
think
a
she
lot of
did. I
connection
think it
issues.
was in dad's name only. However, I would imagine that she spent quite.
They knew she lived
Yeah,
there.
and wasn't the house that Gus was staying in, wasn't that Pete's house? Or did I make that up? Because for some reason I
Mm,
thought that was Pete's house that like and that he was using it after the divorce. Maybe I assumed that.
now that you're no, now that you're saying that, that's kind of coming back to me. But I don't know if that's because you're saying it and to make sense, or if that's because I read it.
Well, if it is Pete's house, then it didn't make any sense to me at all that Pete wouldn't have known. At least
Yeah.
that part. Because dad went out on the boat, like dad lived there and was there and spent time there. Like that was not uncommon for him. So if that was Pete's house, that really doesn't make sense to me. I just would have
Mhm.
liked more clarification, I guess, one way or another.
Well, and whenever Pete like and Sonia are talking about her leaving and January overhears it, Sonia does make it an excuse not to like point out that January, has a problem or whatever.
Yeah.
But I did expect that January was going to go and leave the book club. I didn't expect her to continue to stay, especially after she went and locked herself in the bathroom with a bottle of wine. Like I feel like that would probably get some stares.
I think you might be
Just
correct.
me,
But they
but
also had White Russians, so they were probably also pretty gone with the wind by the time she came out of the bathroom. I do agree though
true.
that I did give Sonia a little credit when she left so that January could stay. I thought that was nice.
Yeah. I did find it hilarious though whenever she realized Gus had arrived, which the whole time they're like, "Well, we're just waiting on another person." I was like, "Okay, it's Gus." Like there was no
Yeah, who
like
else?
lead up to it. Like I think if they would not have led up to it, I probably would have been like, "Oh crap!" Whenever he arrived, but the lead up was like, "Okay, well, it's
Yeah.
him." Which it would have made more sense to me also if they would have done that lead up situation. If it would have been
Mhm.
Sonya that was the one that was showing up, because the whole time you would be thinking, "Oh, it's Gus, it's Gus, it's Gus," and then all of a sudden Sonya walks in, you're like, "Oh, well, I didn't see
Yes.
coming," but so anyways, Gus and her are drinking, and I loved the scene when she goes to leave the book club and Gus is like sitting in his car waiting for her to finally admit that he can drive her
Mhm.
home, and she's like waiting for the town's one and only Uber. And so he ends up driving her home, and I don't know if it was the alcohol or just like the comfort of him or what, but she goes to the donut shop. She gets sobered up with some used donuts, basically, is what my mind processed them
Yeah.
as. I think it's called like day old donuts or something
Something like that.
along that line. Yeah. And so afterwards, they kind of get chatty, and she ends up admitting to him that she's struggling to write, and that's why she's in the town. And he kind of admits that he's also struggling to write. And so they come up with an idea of swapping each other's genres. So Gus will have an idea to write and have a twist of romance to it, and January will have a romance to write with some kind of twist with a not happy ending to it. And they also agree that whoever sells their book first, the other has to write a raving review to go on the cover. You know how most books have like some kind of quoted
Mhm.
author on the front, and even if they didn't like it, they had to say some kind of positive view.
I love
But
the
they also
theory
agree
of,
that
like, them not falling in love and still hating each other, but, like, having to follow through, and forever your quote is on the other person's book and you're stuck with it every time you look at it. I love that.
well, especially because Gus's book seems to haunt January everywhere she goes,
Mhm.
according to especially that one single book, which I can't remember what the title was of it, but they agreed to have sort of like an education weekend as well, where on Fridays they would go and do something for Gus that Gus's would be something that Gus would normally do for research for his
Mhm.
book, and then they would go on Saturdays to do whatever January would typically do for her research.
It's so
Um,
different. I love how different I love them like, the idea of them being polar opposites. That's my favorite part about their love stories, how different they are, but, like, how it still works.
in most situations, to find somebody that works with you, you have to have some kind of difference, because I mean, if you're with the same person, it's not going to be a relationship that makes any sense. Like, I mean, for instance, in case anybody's watching and needs to send us a message to maybe get a date with Carly, she
Stop!
needs somebody that is able to take her strong-willed personality, that was very outspoken, somebody that is willing to listen and pay attention to what she's saying and take in what she's saying,
You're
because
as bad as my
otherwise it's
mother.
not 100%. You need to find your somebody.
I'm good.
Mm-mm.
I'm chilling.
You can be chilling with somebody else. So, moving on to the second part of the book. So, January felt inspired and began writing after this agreement. And for the first set of research, Gus takes her to a lady whose sister was someone in the cult that he's researching for his book. And January takes him to a fair for her part of the romance research. Gus and her start getting closer, and when she has a breakdown on the beach, he comes to comfort her. They end up going to visit the boy who was in a cult with his parents' mom to discuss what all she went through. And as they continue to learn about each other, they eventually both can't hold off their lustful feelings anymore. And January realizes after that night that she's in love with Gus. Um, so there is a little bit of a moment that kind of starts off with the little flirtation, which of course January is pretty much brushing it off as it's not a big important moment, that, oh, I'm just reading too much into it, is how I interpreted her
Yeah,
reaction.
she kinda says, like, "I've
But
romanticized everything, and so I think I'm looking too much into this." In reality, if we got in his point of view, we'd have known that's not the case, but we didn't know that. We thought maybe she was skewed, so
yeah. So he's taking her to go visit a boy whose family was in the cult with him. And so as they're driving there, they stop to get gas, and as he's filling up the tank of gas, he has this little moment, which I'm not quite sure why she got out of the car, or I don't know if she was in the car. It was a very, I didn't interpret it much about the scene, but I imagined her out of the car and him like leaning against her, or her sitting in the car and he leaned into the window and says in her ear, I've read your books. It was like a little,
it was
which
like
honestly,
foreplay.
yeah, I mean, it was like. Like, I guess that's a way author to author, like a flirt. I don't know, but you would think writing something like that, like, or reading other people's, because I'm sure he's read romances of like something that would just not be as flirty. But I mean, it got her worked up.
I don't think he has read other romances. I think he's only read her romances, or at least in my mind, he's only read her romances because then it seems more sweet.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. So whenever they get there, the guy ends up standing them up, and so they just sit there and chit chat, have dinner, and they end up holding hands underneath the table.
Playing
Yes, so
footsies.
they have like, which I mean, I guess they didn't get to live out those dreams in college. So I mean, I guess
It's weird.
I don't know. I also imagine authors not being very socialized because they're constantly sitting and writing all the time. So I mean, I just kind of imagined, where maybe
Like they're awkward.
they, yeah, like awkward romance, especially because you're writing what you dream of, but then like whenever you want to try to like go execute it, it's near impossible. So I absolutely love whenever they're sitting across from each other at their beach house afterwards and they start writing like little Taylor Swift in her music
Yes.
video on a notebook piece of paper. And I loved whenever he wrote January, wherefore art thou January? And she holds up a note that says new phone, who dis. And it was just like a cute little like flirtatious moment. And they kind of are still writing during this time period, so I mean they're kind of sort of working themselves out of their little writing kink. But January ends up deciding to take Gus to a fair, which is a very romantic spot and oftentimes used in a lot of romance books and things like that as something along that
Yeah.
lines. We just got through reading the last song a few weeks ago that had a fair type scene. So, I
True.
mean, very fair. Punny.
Honey.
Very fair. So, anyway, so they go to the fair, and I really
I
loved
I
the
just
thought
really
that they were
love
like
that you
almost like
needed to make sure I
couples.
got the pun. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, you didn't laugh or acknowledge it, so I wasn't sure.
I mean,
You hate my
I don't
puns.
hate your puns. I just don't know that I have to die laughing every time you do one.
You never die laughing at any of them, so I feel like at one point I'm gonna get a pun
I
that you
think it's your
like.
delivery. You're so like monotone when you deliver them.
I'm trying to be casual and part of the conversation.
Anyway, sorry.
I'll be expressive next time. Okay.
Do your little sound effects too while you're at
Will that be fair?
it. I'll die.
Okay. So I love that they're sitting there at the fair and they're people watching, and
Yes.
each person that they're talking about, they have their own perspectives of the story behind the person. Which I do that too whenever I'm people watching. I'm like imagining and thinking like what they're doing and stuff like that. I love people watching. I mean, that's weird like of
It's
mine,
because
but
we're
I
nosy
don't like
people.
people, but I like watching
Yeah, we're
people.
nosy.
Yeah. So I just love that they sat there and he always had some kind of like negative twist about the person and that didn't have like almost like a happy ending, but she always had a positive one. And they decided to flip flop. And so he asked her to like come up with a not happy ending story and he'd come up with a good one, which I thought was very good because I do think that that would kind of spark some ideas for their own characters and things like that to add a little bit of a twist that they're asking
Yeah.
for.
This was one of my
So I do
favorite
think that
scenes in
that
the whole book.
it was one of my favorites as well. So the next weekend, they decide to go visit the boy, and that's whenever they have the scene under the table. So reference back to that whenever I talked about it a few minutes ago. But then her romance part of it was whenever they decide to go to a drive-in movie, and this is really kind of the turning point for a lot of it. However, she still thought he hated her afterwards, so really it was just like a again a little drop in the sand and then move on kind of
Yeah.
thing.
I think it, like I said, we said before,
So
it kind of ruined what we thought it might have been because she was so determined to not think it was something that it wasn't. And so then I was
yes.
like, well, man, am I overthinking it also? Like it made me doubt myself too. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Which is probably really good writing, but like it ruined it kind of for me to be a flirty moment.
Absolutely. And then not only that, but it even more. it added more of like a high schooler aspect to it to me, going into a drive-in movie and then they get kind of hot and heavy in the back of her Kia Soul and a worker comes and taps on the window and kicks them out. But I just really felt like it was a little bit more of like a high schooler kind of scene.
The whole thing was very, like, immature considering they're grown adults.
True, especially on January's part of, "Oh, he hates me. Oh, he doesn't hate me." It was very a very high schooler kind of thing now that you're saying that.
Like,
Yeah,
everything they
I
did was
agree.
sort of, I don't wanna say childish, but it was, like, young and naive, it felt like the entire time. Which maybe was the point because, like,
Mhm.
that's how January's lived her entire life, so we were showing both sides of the coin, I don't know, but I kinda would've preferred, like, a little bit more of a mature, like, you have a nice dinner instead of going to a fair.
Mhm.
Because she's writing
Mhm.
about adults, she's not necessarily just writing about children, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, so it was a little that
Yeah.
threw it off a little bit for me too.
Well, especially knowing that he's writing a cult
Yeah.
setting, you would kind of imagine, because even I'm gonna be honest, even her ideas for his book that she was trying to give him of how to go about the storyline seemed a little bit like immature as
Well, and
well.
I don't know if that was also part of the point because what she believes he writes is childish. Like he thinks maybe, this living in this like childlike innocence for forever is not, that's how she thinks he thinks about her. But he doesn't. But the point is, I think maybe that's what it was trying to show us is that almost like you still can live in that childlike innocence if you choose to and like look at the good that way. But I kind of wish it would have been done in a little bit of a because they are grown.
Mhm.
I mean, he's in the middle of a divorce. Like those are adults, so we're not children.
Well, and I do think kind of I don't wanna say the behavior after she finds out her dad cheated, I do feel like was also childlike in a lot of ways, and I kind of found it a little bit funny that she referred to her mom as acting childlike when her mom was avoiding talking about
Mhm.
it. But and I do think that was another way of basically, in my interpretation of it, her mom was basically trying to protect her as a young child's like thing from what was going on in the world kind of situation. I don't know how else to describe that, but
He wanted her to remain almost like that immature, childlike
childlike.
view,
Even
like
Gus,
even
I
view of
mean,
the world. Yeah, like that was kind of like the whole point. But at the same time, I wish we would have seen her. Or even saying, like, she was trying to do more mature things, and then maybe she wasn't enjoying it as much because she was used to the childlike, or some sort of aspect of that. Because, I mean, they are, like, 30 years old. Like, they're not young. I
mhm.
mean, they're 22, they just graduated college, and, like, well, they're grown adults. So I feel like we should have done and maybe, like, even we started out childlike, and then we did more adult things or whatever. I just would have liked a little bit more of that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. I think another part of that is whenever Gus finds her on the beach and she's breaking down, and it almost to me, I read that scene as almost like a temper tantrum on the beach about her situation. It wasn't very mature, but even to be honest, reading Gus's reaction to it, he was just standing there watching her have a temper tantrum on the beach, and then just kind of she comes over, hugs him, and cries into his chest. I mean, it wasn't a very romantic scene, and honestly up to that point there was a few instances of where he led on to something there maybe, but at that point she still thought he hated
Mhm.
her. So like go and cry into his chest whenever he like hated her just didn't make quite a lot of sense to me either.
It was weird.
But yeah, I mean, it, yeah, I don't know. So she then ends up, after leaving that situation, she ends up going to Pete's books. I think it was at that point she was going in to sign her books, I believe, if
I
I remember
I think you're right.
correctly. And as she's sitting there signing the books, she ends up finding out that Pete is Gus's aunt, which we've already informed you of if you're reading
We've
this
already
or listening
informed
to
you
this for
of.
but she also ends up finding out that he was married before and
Yes.
she actually had left him on his birthday 2 years prior. And so
Crazy.
she
I wish you
very,
would
very
leave me on my
harsh.
birthday. I would make you hate your life.
So she ends up finding out that that was actually the day that she discovered he was having a giant party at his house. And so she ends up having a kind of epiphany that he was probably pretty upset and she was celebrating and she was kind of a crappy person for the way that she kind of reacted to it, but she didn't know the situation. But the next day, the guy that they were supposed to meet whenever they end up going to dinner is at Gus's house, which super weird that his interview would know where he lives. I do feel like that's kind of, I don't know, a line. I guess that's just me. I wouldn't have been telling somebody that I was interviewing where I live, just because I do know how crazy the world can get. So he ends up telling his story about how his mom and dad were in the cult, and he has like a weird reaction afterwards where she ends up pretty upset with him, and
This is the scene that
it
made
was
me
almost like,
concerned that I had been overthinking it all and, like, maybe he actually didn't like her.
yeah. Yeah, so he kind of just like brushes her off. And so they end up leaving to go on to one of his adventures. And he's trying to pry out of her, like, why are you mad at me? Like, what's going on?
'Cause you're a
And
jerk.
yes,
That
yes.
I feel
Well,
like it
he
was
just,
miscommunication trope, I think, and that's what I hated the most about this entire book. I hate that trope.
well, but at the same time, there was like so many different half tropes this entire time.
Yeah,
So it was just like miscommunication. I was expecting that the whole time because it literally was just the tropes were even miscommunicated the entire
true.
time, so it was very hard to understand it. And don't get me wrong, I liked the book. It
Yeah, we
just
have complained a
was,
lot, but I actually did like the book.
yeah, it was just a lot of half stuff there. But I think the ending recovered it a lot for me.
I
So,
agree. And there
but
were
he
moments in the book. I think it just the overall is where we struggled.
but whenever he finally pries out of her what's going on, he ends up admitting that his wife had left him for his best man at the wedding, and that
Wild.
he kind of admits, I don't hate you. I didn't sit through hours of listening to you talk, I believe is what he says, to judge you the entire time. One of the quotes he said was, your mom didn't leave when your dad cheated on her, and my mom didn't leave with my dad when he broke my effing arm, and yet I couldn't do anything to make my wife stay. And so she ends up realizing that he was almost like ashamed and embarrassed by the fact that his wife had left him. And the quote that January says that I really liked was, from the time he was a kid, no one had chose him, and he was embarrassed by that, like it meant something about him. I wanted to tell him that it didn't, that it wasn't because he was broken, but because everyone else was. And so I did really feel sorry for Gus, because he did grow up his whole life thinking that everybody didn't like him. And I think that that may be why he wasn't very good at communicating his feelings and showing his feelings and things, and a little awkward by it.
I think, like
But I,
I think that was kind of the scene where she realized, like, he's damaged, like, he has trauma he has not dealt with, and it almost made sense to her why he looked at the world as so awful and maybe why he wouldn't wanna
mm,
fall in love again, because it's never done him a favor. You know what I mean? That
mm,
right there was the moment, like, we actually got Gus in the big picture and, like, how he is, why he is, sort of thing, and that, for me, and I guess that was kind of mid-book, but that really helped me understand better at that point. I would have liked that maybe a little bit sooner.
agreed. I do really like whenever he does say as well, I think it's brave to believe in love. I mean, the lasting kind, to try for that, even knowing it can hurt you, because he'd never been brave for that. I think Naomi was a safe choice for him. I think Naomi was a safe comfort for him, that he didn't actually, I don't know if he ever actually really loved her, because he still mentioned the entire time of the relationship eventually that he was thinking about January, and wondering where that could have gone to.
That's crazy. Fear is like falling in love with somebody, and the entire time they're thinking about some lost love that they never had a chance with, and they never loved me as much as her. That's like my biggest fear. That's scary.
I can definitely understand that. But there is also the fact that whenever you're in love with somebody, that they could fall in love with somebody else. It's a never ending risk that you're taking. Whenever they say that you're waking up every day and it's a choice, I mean, it really is a
You
choice,
missed me.
because, I
Take my
mean,
finger across my throat.
well, I mean, it is really a choice every day, that you have to trust that that person that you've chosen and you've fallen in love with is not going to fall in love with somebody else. And I mean,
The
I
best
think
man at
that
your wedding.
obviously in this, yeah.
It's
So, I mean, obviously in this
crazy.
book, Naomi woke up one day, decided that she was not going to be in love with Gus anymore and was going to be in love with his best man, and then woke up another day and decided she's going to be back with Gus. So I mean, you can't take for granted the moments that you have with that person, but at the same time, like, even January realized, like, oh, he woke up today and decided it wasn't me. And so it's one of those things that you take a risk on no matter what, and unfortunately it doesn't work out for
For
everybody.
the
And
majority of
obviously,
people.
even,
That's
I
why I'm
mean,
in
obviously
business.
Gus obviously obviously Gus, January, and even her mom went through situations where they woke up one day and their significant other was in love with somebody else, or they thought they were in love with somebody else and then come back to them, kind of
Yeah,
situation. To be honest, I think that was the only steady theme that actually
it
went all the way
was.
through this book, to be
This is
honest,
like
now that
a
I'm saying that
romance,
out
but really
loud.
the theme is like love sucks. Good luck.
Yeah. It's the underlining baseline. But I mean, every one of their stories was, we're massively in love, then we're not, they're with somebody else, and then they're back with me. I mean, all three of them had that same situation happen. So even so, with Sonia was about the only one that got the short end of the stick with that. So, but she kind of asked him to tell her his story. And he talks about how he had been abused, and that how his dad had just randomly woke up some days and decided that he was the problem, that he was the reason why his day was crappy. He even said, I believe at one point, that if the phone rang and woke him up, he would hit Gus because it would be his fault. She also, at some point, I don't know if it was this point or earlier, but she also learned that he doesn't like his name Augustus because that's what his dad referred to him as. So that's what kind of upset him with his name, is because it was almost like a trigger for him to relate back to the abuse. And so they end up deciding that they're going to go the day of his research to go talk to, I believe his name was Dave, his mother, and get her side of the story, since Dave was so young whenever he was a part of the cult, to kind of get her perspective of everything. And she discusses kind of what they went through and things. And
Different from how Dave views what happened. And that's also one of my favorite parts of this book is like because it's not necessarily and I think January points that out and I think Gus says this, but I could be wrong. But like, there's three sides to every story. Yours, mine, and what actually
Mhm.
happened because we all see and experience things differently. And so I loved getting to see that even in this book, just in those small moments, how mom still like made the excuses and tried to see what she wanted to see and Dave didn't. Dave saw it as the worst thing possible ever. That was just really interesting to again the opposite sides of the same thing.
Yeah, I really think that, to be honest, that was a majority of the stories. Is, even in Dad's mistress case, it was mom, dad, mistress, January, and then also the actual
Yep.
situation. So, I mean, in multiple instances, there are several sides to the story that she didn't get the story. So I think that Dave's story was added in there almost like that,
Yeah.
where you could relate that there's multiple sides of the story. And I think that was a kind of an epiphany that January had, that, oh, maybe there's another perspective to what happened. So Shadi, and she is talking with her about how she's fallen in love with haunted hats, which I honestly, though, multiple of my friends, when we talk about people, or like even like my coworkers, I'm just like, yeah, we're talking about so and so. Like, there was a girl that used to fall asleep at work all the time, and we call her a sleepy. So every time we mention sleepy, we know who we're talking about. So we do that all the time. And
I think it's a
so, I
girl thing.
mean,
Like we give nicknames to everybody.
possibly, possibly. I know I do that a lot.
Like I even have songs that go with certain people. If I hear it, I'm like, oh, remember when she did that? I don't know. I think it's a girl thing.
And then she goes and bails on her, which honestly, I did find it very crappy, because it didn't seem like she goes through a lot of guys with flirting and stuff like that, or at least thinking she's in love with him.
Yeah.
And so she goes and bails on her whenever. And I hated it because her friend was very clearly in a bad spot. Her friend dad died, her boyfriend broke up with her mom's basically not talking to her. She thinks her arch nemesis hates her guts and lives next door to her. and she's in this town she's not familiar with. She's cleaning out her dad's mistress's house. Like all this bad stuff is happening to her in this moment, and her friend's just like, "Well, I'm falling in love with this guy that I randomly met that I'm gonna go spend Fourth of July with instead of coming and being there and supporting
Yeah.
you." I did feel it was very crappy on a friendship level. I mean, if you called me and said, "Hey, like, can you be here?" and then I'd be like, "Oh no, me and Trevor are gonna go do this." I'm gonna bail on him in a moment if you say, "Hey, I really need you to be there." Like, sorry,
I don't know that
but
she had
I know there's gonna be another.
and I'm not defending her because I think she should have come also. But at the same time,
Yeah,
I don't think January fully explained at that point yet the struggle she was really having, other than dad. We do see it later, and Shotty does drop everything and come.
yes, but I do feel like in that moment that what's all like she knew what all was going on with
Yeah,
her, but she still chose not to. Like, to me, if somebody's going through something hard or something, if you're talking to them regularly, even if it's through text message, you know when they're not responding the same as what they normally do. And especially like everything she compounded that happened to her, it should have been a moment like, I'm just going to go and check on her, and then like after 2 days, if she's fine, okay, I'll probably go and just, if you don't mind, I'll dip out and go be with him since you're doing okay. But I do think that it would have been, even to FaceTime her and like give her the respect of like having that moment where she's like, "Hey, I think I'm falling in love with this guy. How's things going with you?" And if the moment she read on her face is she's not doing all right, or she's faking it, or even if she was faking it and you thought she was serious, I would have still dropped everything to check on somebody who was going through that much change in their life,
yeah,
because I mean that's a lot to handle all at one time, even if it was just a FaceTime phone
yeah.
call. I think it would have taken an extra step of point in time that she should have done for
I do
her.
agree. I'd come the first visit and not push it off to the second one. I don't think she was fully aware of what level her and Gus were at yet, but knowing that dad died, dad has a mistress, and now I'm in their house, I think was enough that she should have come and checked on her. I
Yes.
totally agree with that.
And then on top of it, she broke up with her long-term
Yes, and
boyfriend
that.
who,
Yeah.
yeah, which I'm sure she probably knew how he broke up with her and everything like that. I would assume you would at least tell your friend
Yeah, I
that,
think
but
she knew.
I don't think she ever specified that for sure. I do think that the reason why it was in this story was because of the whole scene that we ended up getting with Gus and Maggie and Pete on the 4th of July. However, it still was sucky on a friend's part.
I didn't like the
I
way
don't know.
Gus acted at the 4th of July party.
I didn't either. But back to with the Shadid as well, I also wanted to say that I do think that as far as that kind of friendship did seem a little bit one-sided as well, because it did seem like a lot of the times, which it could just be in that moment, it did seem like they were only like crossing paths kind of friendship, but it did seem like whenever they did text and talk, it was all about Shadi and her new love. It was, and then it was briefly like, "How are you doing? Okay, all right." And then it was almost like a joke when they were trying to talk about something serious with that was going on. So I did hate that for her. And honestly, I still didn't like Shadi even after her visit. I still just felt like it was very, I don't know, not a very healthy friendship, I guess. I
It
don't
was
know.
weird, and I don't know if that was on purpose or if it was accidental or what happened. Um, but we also don't get a lot of moments that show like January's really there for Shadi either. So we don't really know if it's one side. You know what I mean? Like we didn't get the full scope. But I do agree. She should have come down. And then even when she did come down, it was weird. She wasn't really important. I don't know.
Well, and I mean, I'm going to be honest, I've had one sided friendships a lot in my life. And I mean, I still have some to this day that, occasionally they're there for me kind of situation. So I keep in touch with that. But I did have to go through a process in my life where I had to cut off a lot of my one sided friendships because it was always, what they wanted, what they needed, and never like a check in on me kind of
Yep.
situation. And so, I mean, of course, I've narrowed it down to like four good friends of mine. Sometimes those friendships work for some people. And at the time, those friendships worked for me. So, I mean, I understand where this is maybe a time in January's life where she needed a distraction. She needed some kind of friendship like that where it was good to go, get away out of her own problems and her own situation. But, and that may be what's happening is, Shadi knew that that was what she needed, but I just didn't feel like it was very right of her to bail on January whenever obviously she needed
That's
her.
fair.
So they end up deciding for the 4th of July that they are going to go to Pete's house and hang out. And before they actually get to that, they actually start having a little bit of like a flirty situation happening where they are basically during the day at her house, and then in the evenings they're going to Gus's. And during the day it's like business at her house, and then it's fun at Gus's house in the evening. I don't believe at this point they've kind of taken it to the next level by any means, but they're
Wasn't
definitely,
it right we
you know,
did?
yes. So they're definitely just getting in that flirty situation. And she starts learning a little bit more about Gus and his life and about how he had to drop out of school to get an insurance paying job at a grounds at to be a groundskeeper at a cemetery.
I love how
And
she was like, "That's
I
so on
do
point with your personality." I thought that was hilarious.
I mean, yes, by the description of him, I do think that that was, something that would have worked for him pretty well. But I do find it extremely sad that, almost depressing how his life had to be because he wasn't loved by his
Mhm.
family. And obviously some people experience that, and I do hate that he had to go through something like that to basically make himself be able to live. So Gus invites her to Pete's, and whenever he does, she immediately says yes, but then she kind of backtracks and she's like, well, actually, Pete's friends with my dad's mistress, which I think that was the first time he had told Gus who she was. And so Gus ends up kind of devising a plan to work around that. And so he shows up at her house while she's finally decided to brave the basement, which the entire time she put off the basement because she thought Shadi was going to come and discover the sex dungeon with her in the basement. But she ends up going down there, and Gus ends up surprising her, and they have a hot and heavy kind of scene in the basement where they end up deciding to run into or over to his house to get a condom to fully take it to the next level in their relationship. However, when they are finished, Gus gets a phone call and he basically just tells her, "Hey, I'll see you later, peace,"
Yeah.
which is really not the way you want your first time with somebody to go
Especially
whatsoever.
and, like, in general,
Mhm.
nowadays, we have such a hookup culture that sometimes it doesn't mean anything for people, and, like, that's their prerogative, but for her, it did. So then for him to act that way really bothered her. It would have really bothered me too. At that point, I was like, "Oh, I don't like him. I'm concerned of where this love story's going."
Well, and she just kind of kept brushing it off as it's an important phone call. It's something he had to take, which,
I thought it was his
I
ex-wife.
mean, yes, I thought it was too, but at the same time, I mean, when we find out that it was his attorney, I don't still feel like it was that important to stop what you were doing to take. I mean, that you could have returned her phone call after the fact.
Agreed. But it was his friend who is his attorney, so it wasn't like it was only business, so we don't really know the extent of what she might also been calling to wish him happy 4th, but I think he could have let it go to voicemail and then called her back later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like if he was waiting on significant news of like him getting custody of some kids or, you know, I don't know. Even if it was, hey, your divorce is finally finalized or something like that, I don't feel like it would have been necessarily something you had to hear right then in that
Nope, I
moment.
agree.
You could have waited another 10 minutes and been like, hey, you want to run and start getting dressed and we'll go to the 4th or whatever. And then as she leaves, he could be like, okay, well, let me call her back real
Yeah,
quick.
could have been handled differently.
So I don't know. Yeah. So by that point, she's kind of
Let me
pretty
also just
upset.
add, I love that he keeps his condoms on his bookshelf. Thought that was hilarious and very on point.
Yeah, well, I mean, she tells him that, and he says, "Well, just on the go kind of situation, like it's like a tied to go stick or something."
Yeah,
Um,
hilarious. I like though that
but
he didn't carry one around with him, like he wasn't expecting that to happen, but then for him to act that way afterwards, I was like, "I don't know, you're giving me hot and cold. You need to go away."
was it this book where they express that he's very like one and done kind of situation,
Yes.
or like yeah? So I think she thought that he was just waiting for the chase, and then he was done with her once he finally got her kind of situation.
After the party, yes, that's what she starts thinking because he's acting weird and disappears and everything else. And he's having like
Yeah.
a
So
midlife crisis thinking, maybe not a midlife crisis, but he's having a crisis thinking, "Oh my gosh, I I don't want it to be one and done. Like, he's panicking when he realizes how much he likes her, and she's fully convinced that he hates her and, like, all he wanted to do was that and then go back to being friends. And she's like, "I can't do that." So it's like, again, it's communication trope. Hate it.
Mhm.
Too blunt. I would've
I
just said it. I would've just said what I
well,
thought.
I do think waiting until, like, later, way after the party to kind of
Have a
confront the issue was a
breakdown,
little well, and not only that, but, like, during the party, they act like everything was fine for the most part. I mean, whenever they're sitting there talking to Maggie and Pete, and they're kinda, like, telling stories of a childhood and, all that kinda
and then
stuff.
they
It just
swim,
seemed like
and it's after that he disappears, and that's when he, like, really started acting weird. And then from there on, like, he stops, like, messaging her as often and whatnot. Like, I was like, I think it was, like, days without talking to her.
well, but my thing is too is before that, she honestly was, like, upset before this. But then during the party, she like makes a joke about going and sneaking off with him, and he like turns her down, and that's when she gets angry because she's like, "Oh, he doesn't want me in the middle of his family's party," which honestly is a weird situation in general. Like, I don't think I could ever just be like, "Hey, like let's go." Everybody's going to know when you're sneaking off and doing that. Like, I don't know. I just and then all of that, it's not your house, it's not your place. I don't know. I feel weird about that. Like, it's
I do
just
too. I don't think that was appropriate. I don't think she was being serious, though. I think she was joking, and I think she made the joke to see what he would say. And when he didn't like play along with it, she then got insecure and offended.
yeah. Yeah. Well, then afterwards, whenever she gets angry, she ends up storming home basically. And whenever they get there, she ends up making a statement in her head. When it came down to it, I knew exactly who Gus Everett was, and it didn't change a thing because even though he probably would never learn to dance in the rain, it was Gus that I wanted, only Gus, exactly Gus. So she believes that they're done. They're over at this point, which I hated the fact that they just didn't say anything. And then not only that, but then afterwards, I'm pretty sure that's the point where he disappears for a few days.
Yes.
And so I hated that for her because then she never really did get that solidification. And I could understand where if he disappears for several days, you would think that, oh, maybe he's like gone off and we're never going to see each other ever again. So,
Yeah. The uncertainty.
um, so to start the third part of the book, January realizes during her anger at Gus that she was falling in love with him. She decides to go visit New Eden with Gus for the research day, and he's trying to push her away, and she thinks it's because he regrets her. He ends up admitting that he only pushed her away so she didn't have to see the world as he did. This admission ends up bringing them closer together and harder to stay, and keeps it hard and makes it harder for them to stay away from each other. At their book signing, Naomi appears, and January thinks that's it for whatever Gus and her was starting. She ends up finding out that all of her dad's letters after a talk with Sonia, and she finally admits to her mom what all really happened with her ex and etc. They end up admitting their love for each other, and they end up deciding that they're going to live forever and they're happy for now. And so we start off this little section with Gus giving or texting January about going to New Eden, which is the place where the cult took place that he's researching. And basically, January is taking it as he's trying to push her not to come, which he admits in the end that that was kind of what he was trying to do. But he's basically just trying to say, like, hey, you don't have to come if you don't want to. And she's like, are you trying to kick me out of going? Like, or do you not want me to go? And he's like, no, you can go if you want to. I just don't want you to feel like you have to go. And so she ends up going almost. To me, I took it a little bit of like, well, since you don't want me to go, I'm going to go anyways kind of behavior, which again, a little high school. So it was a little immature, but I do think that was the main reason why she ended up going in the first place. But I do really enjoy when they do pull up at they have to hike a little bit to get to the New Eden. And whenever they pull up, I love that whenever they pull up, January says, this looks like someone's murder, or this looks like a spot for you to murder me. And he says, it's probably someone's, but it's not mine. And so he he does kind of try to joke with her, but I do think he was still a little too serious and a little too like brush off in the moment in person. And I do think that's why it kind of expedited her feelings of frustration towards him. But whenever they do get to the site, they decide to set up a tent to store like their computers and stuff because it is slightly rainy and wet. And so she goes inside of this tent and she says the quote, I couldn't go hide from this. I couldn't leave Gus here alone. And if he was descending into the darkness, I was going to tie a rope between our waists and go down with him. And so at this point, I think she realized that what what they were there to view was something that was going to be hard to look at. It was going to be difficult because in this cult that he was researching, apparently they had set fire to a majority of the compound and ended up killing quite a few people, from my understanding.
including children.
Um, yes, and so basically Gus was going there to kind of get, I don't want to say get the vibes of the place, but kind of get an understanding of how it could have happened, kind of
He was like
like
mapping
put his
out
eyes
the
on,
layout.
yeah, because he's collected a lot of information at this point, so he can kind of, based on all their stories, kind of get an understanding of how this was all going. But I also think he was also doing it to kind of use as a description in his book to be able to describe the way it was set up, the way it looked, that kind of thing as
Yeah.
well. So, whenever they're walking around, I think it's one of the main buildings where I understood it as one of the main buildings where several people had passed. They were going to go look at, and Gus tells her to go ahead and go back to the tent, and she didn't have to be there for that. So, she goes back to the tent and she kind of stews in the tent for a little bit until he comes back in, and she ends up confronting him and ask him what in the world's going on, like, you were fine and then all of a sudden you've kind of just been like real harsh. And he admits that the phone call that he had taken the other day was his lawyer Kayla, which is also one of his best friends, but is also one of Naomi, his ex-wife's best friends. And he started talking about the fact that she had called because he had, I guess, gone, they were trying to settle the divorce, and Naomi basically said that she wanted to visit with him one last time before she made the decision. So I do think he was thinking he was going to get a call that the divorce is finalized. Naomi signed the paperwork whenever he took that call. However, she was actually calling to say that Naomi wanted to reevaluate some things, which he says, hey, we didn't really own very much together, so I don't know exactly what she could have been reevaluating in the first place. But Gus tells her that he thought that the entire time that she hated him, and she's basically saying, well, I thought you hated me the whole time. So again, miscommunication. He talks about how drawn out the divorce has been, and that almost she's just been refusing to sign the paperwork. And so he does end up saying that he mentioned to Kayla that he was with January, and Kayla almost kind of puts doubt in his head about, well, she broke your heart last time by not wanting you. Are you going to go through that again? And she says, what are you talking about? You never even spoke to me because you hated me. And he says, I could never figure out what I had done. And then I saw you at the party and you were finally looking at me. That's my point. I'm an idiot when it comes to you. And she goes on to describe, well, you hated me this whole time. You were critiquing my stories and all of this kind of thing. And if you want to read that quote.
Okay, so they're arguing back and forth, and she's like, "What do you mean? Like, you've always hated me, whatever." And she's like, "Well, what did you think me taking your pants off meant?" And he says, "That's what I'm trying to tell you. What I've been trying to tell you since you got here. I don't remember how any of this is supposed to work or what I'm supposed to do. Even before Naomi and January, I'm not like Jacquees." And she says, "What's that supposed to mean?" He says, "I'm not the kind of guy women try to date. I never have been. I'm the one they want to hook up with and drunk text and hang out with for a change of pace when they've just gotten out of a 7-year relationship with doctors, and that's fine. But I don't want that with you. Okay? I can't do that." And she says, "That's what you think? That this is all some kind of identity crisis for me? Some eat, pray, love?" And he says, "I want to be your perfect effing Fabio, January, but I can't. I'm not." And she says, "I don't need you to be Fabio." And he says, "Yes, you do. Everything I've done in the last 24 hours has hurt you. You want me to be able to read you, and I can't. And you want me to know how to do this, and I don't." She said, "No. I just want you to tell me how you feel. I want to know what it is you want." And he said, "I'm going to mess this up." She said, "Maybe, but that's not what I asked. Tell me what you want, Gus. Not why you can't have it, or what I think I want, or why you can't give that to me. Tell me what you want for once. That's all I'm asking you to do." And he says quietly, "I want you. I want you in every way possible. I want to take you on dates and play with a beach ball and a pool with you, but I'm a wreck, January. I'm trapped in a marriage with a woman who lives with another man just waiting to be done. I'm on medicine, I'm in therapy, I'm trying to give up smoking for good and even learn how to meditate. And while that's going on, while I'm a walking dumpster fire, I want you in a way I'm not sure either of us can handle. I don't want to hurt you and I don't want to feel what it would be like to lose you. It doesn't mean I don't want you, January. I've always wanted you. It just means I also want you to be happy, and I'm scared I could never be the person who could give you that. And she says, then let me be happy with you, Gus.
I honestly like several of his parts of speeches I love,
Well,
which I mean
I'm
obviously
gonna
he's a
say he's a
writer.
writer, so
So
he's away with words. It just takes him
yeah.
a while to get to
But
those words.
yes, like I mean it just the way he speaks is just ugh, it makes my knees weak. So they end up having like a I call it a sexcapade in their tent where they had like a night of
Sex.
sex. And she does call the next day and, you know, gossip with her best friend. And they end up going into breakfast, which end up turning to a trip to a bookstore. And Gus ends up confessing his love again to her.
So she asks him, why did you try to keep me away from New Eden? I mean, I know you said you didn't want me to have to see it, and I get that, except that the whole point of this bet was for you to convince me the world was how you said it was, right? And that was the perfect opportunity. He was quiet for a long moment and then asked, do you really think that that's what this was about? And she said, I mean, I hope it was at least partially an elaborate ruse to sleep with me. And he says, I never wanted you to see the world like I see it. And she starts, but the bet. And he interrupts, I just thought maybe if you tried to write what I write, I don't know. I guess I hoped you'd realize it wasn't right for you. Not because you're not capable, but because it's not you. The way you think about things, it's not like that. I always thought the way you saw the world was incredible, and I never wanted you to lose that. She said, even if what I'm seeing isn't real. And he says, when you love someone, you want to make this world look different for them, to give all the ugly stuff meaning and amplify the good. That's what you do. For your readers, for me, you make beautiful things because you love the world. And maybe the world doesn't always look how it does in your books. But I think putting them out there, that changes the world a little bit. And the world can't afford to lose that. I've always admired that. The way your writing always makes the world seem brighter and the people in it a little bit braver. And she says, or maybe I'm just right, and sometimes people are brighter and braver than they are. He said, I don't think I've ever loved the world like you do. I remember being afraid of it, and then angry with it, and then just deciding not to feel too strongly about it. But I don't know. Maybe when I do this, when I talk to people like Dave and walk through burning buildings, there's a part of me that's hoping I'm going to find something. And she said, like what? And he said, like the kind of world you write about. Like proof that it isn't as bad as it looks, or it's more good than bad. Like if we added up all the shit and all the wildflowers, the world would come out positive.
I do really like that. And then he does end up saying after she goes on a rant about her dad, and honestly, probably one of my favorite lines from the entire book. And he says, I don't need snowflakes as long as there's January.
This right
Love
here
that.
summed up like the whole point of the entire book for me. Not even necessarily their love story, but like
Yes.
in general, viewing the world and what that means and everything. I took that more away from this book than I did the actual romance, I'm going to be honest.
To be honest, I would have loved, absolutely loved, if this whole book ended on that sentence.
I kind of agree.
Because I do feel like that literally just like it was a perfect closure moment. I mean, obviously there was some other points I like after the fact of like clarifying her dad and stuff like
Yeah.
that, but this whole sentence could have been at the end of the last confession he has of love, and that's how the book ended. I mean, I would have absolutely loved that as a last sentence. I had chills in that moment of reading it, and I was like, "Oh, it's the last paragraph. It's the last paragraph by that sentence," because it was literally the last sentence on my Kindle page. So I was like, "Oh, it's done." I didn't pay attention to the percentage or anything like that. I just clicked to look at the acknowledgments, and I was like, "Oh no, there's more." Okay, well, all right, I'll keep reading. It was such a good sentence that I just felt like it really did end the book right there.
Well, and
I don't know.
honestly, the only scene relevant after that is I think where the girl shows up to the book signing or whatever, and she thinks all is going to fall apart, and then they have their happy ever after. Like, I think that really
Yeah.
is all that's after that.
Yeah, so Gus and January actually have like a book event at Pete's bookstore, and Naomi, his ex-wife, ends up showing up to there. And because he goes over to talk to her, January thinks that's it for the relationship, which was again a immature situation.
Dramatic.
She ends up running home basically. And whenever she gets there, she ends up discovering Sonia on her front porch. And Sonia ends up kind of describing their relationship, her and her dad's the entire point, kind of, well, more like a summary. And she goes, I'm sure by now you've read the letters that kind of help you understand most of this. And she's like, what letters? I only received a letter. And she was like, so you haven't even read the first one yet. So she ends up going inside, grabbing the first letter, and she ends up finding out, which Gus and her had already previously found a safe that they weren't sure the combination, which automatically I would have been like, it's my birthday. Like the entire time
Me
I
too.
was like screaming at the book, like, it's your birthday. It's not your mom. It's not Sonia. It's your birthday. It was very obvious. But, anyways, so she ends up getting to the safe and she ends up finding the rest of the letters that her dad had been writing to her. I believe it was one, maybe there was one that was like 2 a year or something like that.
Let me
But,
tell you this,
um,
nothing in this
mhm.
book made me cry until we got to these letters, and then I was, like, sobbing, sobbing reading these letters. I was doing so good, I was so proud.
I can see that.
Luckily, look, I was reading this actually on the beach when I read it. Luckily, that part wasn't till I got back to the house, because if I had read this in public, I would have been embarrassed.
Well, and whenever she is talking to Sonia, I really like the paragraph that kind of ended their conversation, that she says, "Oh, honey, we can never fully know the people we love. When we lose them, there will always be more we could have seen." And that's what I'm trying to tell you. This house, this town, this view, it was all a part of him that he wanted to share with you. And you're here, all right? You're here and you've got a house on the beach. He lived in a town he loved, and you've got all of the letters. And that, again, is at the point where she asked, like, what kind of letters? But I mean, it's very true. He could have kept it a secret from her the entire time, because obviously the mom's not telling her
Mhm.
anything. So he could have kept a secret from her of that and just gave the house to Sonia when he passed, and she could have dealt with it. But obviously he wanted her to know that point of her, and which honestly he also gifted her a boat, which I, was a little weird to me. I don't really know, and honestly what happened to the boat, never find out. But it's just a weird part of the scene that, I mean, obviously she just goes and reads her letters there, and he talks about pretty much every year of her life, how what was going on, what was happening. And so she does end up calling her mom after she reads all this, and her mom asks, Janie, what's wrong? Are you okay? And she says, no. And she says, tell me, honey. I'm here now, honey. Just tell me everything. And I love that her response is, did I tell you Jaquise broke up with me in a hot tub? And she said, that little shit weasel. And it
Yes.
just instantly started telling her everything. And the very next day, her best friend ends up arriving, which I don't know if she called her or if the mom called her. I'm not quite sure how that ended up happening. But she arrives and she sits down and she's like, trying to go through every account of what has happened up to this point. And I love whenever Shadi says, I think it's time for you to fall in love. All this time I've known you and ever gotten to see it, I think it is time. And she said, well, you knew me before Jacques. You watched that happen. She said, yeah, I know you loved him. And maybe in the end, it's the same thing you wind up with. But with him, you never fell, Janie. You marched straight in. And she says, so falling's the part that hurts. And if you wind up in love without it hurting, then there's no falling. And she said, no, falling's the part that takes your breath away. It's the part when you can't believe the person standing in front of you both exist and happen to wander into your path. It's supposed to make you feel lucky to be alive, exactly when and where you are. And I think that's such a good summary of it. And honestly, it's crazy to me, she didn't ask for that summary before she started writing romance books. She just winged it, and I
Yeah,
mean, without really an understanding of it. So I loved that
me
though.
too.
And while they're sitting there talking, she ends up getting a knock at the door, which she kind of sort of ignores for a moment, and then she decides to answer it. But by the time she gets there, Gus is gone. And so she thinks she's lost him forever, almost like this dramatic scene where she's standing in the driveway, like, he's gone. god, where did he go?
Because she can't see his
And
car
she
in
turns,
his driveway, so she thinks he drove away as opposed to just going back to his house.
yeah, and so she turns around and she ends up getting a porch light flickering on, which she thinks is actually Shadi turning on the light, but turns out it was Gus coming out of his house. And I don't know if you want to read the quote. He says, she asked if we can make our marriage work.
Yes. Okay. And she said she'd been thinking about it for a long time, but she wanted to wait to make sure I wasn't her rebound. And January says, how could you be her rebound? You're her husband. He laughs and said, I said something like that. And he says, she's not a bad person. And January says, glad to hear it. And he says, really, why? She says, you shouldn't be married to an asshole, I guess. Probably no one should, except maybe other assholes. And he said, well, that's the thing. She asked me if I could ever forgive her. And I think I could. I mean, eventually. And then she asked if I could see myself being with her again. And I can imagine it. I think it's possible. And January says, I thought maybe I should say something. Oh, good. Well then. The pain didn't seem content to have been heard. It roared up in me. Gus, I whispered, and closed my eyes as more hot tears streamed out of them. Gus says, she asked if we could make our marriage work. And he says, I never expected to hear her say that. And I don't know. I needed time to figure it all out. So I went home and I just started to think it all through. And I wanted to call you, but it seemed so selfish to call you like that and make you help me figure it out. So I just spent all day yesterday thinking about it. And at first I thought I could definitely be with Naomi again. But even if we could be together, I didn't think I could ever be married again. It was all too messy and painful. And then I thought about that more and I realized I didn't mean it. January's thoughts are I tightened my eyes as more tears pushed out. Please, I wanted to beg him, stop. But I felt stuck in my own body, held prisoner. January, he said softly, look at me. What I meant is, I did mean it about her and me. I didn't mean it about you. I've never met someone who is so perfectly my favorite person. When I think about being with you every day, no part of me feels claustrophobic. And when I think about having to have the kind of fights with you that Naomi and I used to have, there's nothing scary about that because I trust you more than I've ever trusted anyone, even Pete. When I think about you, January, I think about doing laundry with you and trying terrible green juice cleanses and going to antique malls with you, and I only feel happy. The world looks different than I ever thought it could be, and I don't want to look for what's broken or what could go wrong. I don't want to brace myself for the worst and miss out on being with you. I want to be the one who gives you what you deserve. And I want to sleep next to you every night and to be the one you complain about book stuff to. And I don't think I could ever deserve any of that. And I know this thing between us isn't a sure thing, but that's what I want to aim for with you because I know no matter how long I get to love you, it will be worth whatever comes after. And he says, it'll be worth it. She says, you can't know that. He said, fine, I can't know it, but I believe it. I see it. Let me prove I'm right. Let me prove I can love you forever. She says we're both wrecks. It's not just you. I wanted to think it was, but it's not. I'm a disaster. I feel like I need to relearn everything, especially how to be in love. Where would we even start? And he says, here. He said, when I watch you sleep, I feel overwhelmed that you exist. And she said, what if we don't get a happy ending, Gus? And he said, then maybe we should just enjoy our happy for now.
And see, again, another good point that it could have ended
We- I mean,
right
we get the
there
epilogue
at that
then, so
point.
it kind of ends, but
Yeah. So, but I mean, I would have just loved that snowflakes in January as long as I have January. It was such a good line to end on. Even happy for now is nice, but it just like it still didn't like give me the goosebumps.
I cried two
But
parts. That part and Dad's letters, and that's it. And I was impressed with myself.
so we get into 9 months later when they are exchanging their books to read on the beach. And
So
January's
cute.
book apparently had sold first, and Gus had actually made more money. But of course, January ended up winning the butt. So they've been spending a time at the beach house of Gus's and also in her apartment in town above a music store. And Gus decided that instead of a big party this year, he wanted to sit on the beach and read with January. So after January finishes reading his book, she's crying and he's like, "Hey, what's wrong?" And she says, "So much for your happy ending." Because the agreements was, if you remember, he had to write a happy ending and she had to write one that's not so happy. And so he says it was a happy ending. And she says, for who? And he says, for them. They were happy. They had no regrets. They'd won. And they didn't even have to see it coming. For all we know, they lived in the moment forever, happy like that, together and free. And she goes on to describe how she felt or whatever. And she says, I guess we both failed. And he said, I don't think so. I think I wrote my version of a happy ending and you wrote your version of a sad one. We had to write what we think is true. And you still believe a meteor hitting the earth is the best case scenario in a romance, is what she said. And he kind of laughs. And he says, if I were hit by a meteor while in the car with you, yes, I would still think I went out on a high note. And I really loved that their perspective of the world is so different, but at the same time so similar in their own ways.
Yep.
But after they end up going back, she thinks they're having some kind of anniversary party, and there is Pete, her mom, Maggie, Shadi, her new boyfriend, Kayla. They're all at the beach house, and he says, I have a good idea, January. And he kneels down in front of her, and she says, another Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And he says, January Andrews, a year ago I met you for the second time and it changed my life. I don't care how it ends as long as I spend it with you. And he pulls out a little piece of paper and it says, marry me on it. And she agrees to marry him, and they live their happy ever after, and it ends up becoming together for happy for nows.
So cute.
And I just love that. So that is the end of our opinions.
Our opinions.
Well,
It's
no,
not.
it's just the start of the beginning, I guess I should say. So, what was your final rating?
I think I would rate this book a 4.4. Most of that point 0.6 I took away is because we don't get his point of view and for the miscommunication trope. Like, I know I complained a lot in this
Okay.
episode, but I actually did enjoy this book. I just have a few things that I think would have made it even, but
Mm-hmm.
I did overall enjoy the book. I don't like the miscommunication trope. I don't like that in any book, though. It doesn't matter to me. I don't like it in real life. I don't like any of it. Especially when you're adults. I feel like you just say that. You know what I mean? Just not for me. But I think missing out on his point of view really increased that miscommunication trope and could have solved it, at least for the readers, maybe not for January, but would have solved it for us at least. And then it would have just been a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
ride the entire book instead of that confusing little parts.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, I really enjoyed it. And I'm excited to read something else by Emily Henry because this was the first one that I've read by her. What about you?
I'm kind of in the same ballgame as you. I was at a 4.3. I thought it was a very interesting perspective of a love story in a different way than I normally read them. I do have to say that I do think that the concept was very good. However, I do think that certain tropes or concepts of it was not fully there. I do think that if she would have narrowed it down to maybe 3 tropes or 4 or even 5, maybe she could have perfected those better to get the sense of it. It was a lot of whiplash with the tropes of, like we said, back and forth kind of situation. I did think that a lot of questions got answered at the end, so I like having that solidifying of a lot of the questions that were brought up. But it wasn't my favorite love story. It's probably not one that I will read again. But overall, it was not terrible. I did the ending a lot. I told Carly before I started all this that there was a lot of quotes at the end that I really loved. I really loved how basically the last 100 pages are probably my favorite part of the
Yeah.
book. I think if the ending would have been scattered throughout the rest of the book, it probably would have made it better for me. But again, it was one of those books that kind of introduced some storylines and people and things that I think could have been left out to add. She could have added more description into the tropes or more description into a situation with Gus and January to make it better on their part. So, I mean, overall, it wasn't terrible, but it's not one of my favorite ones that I've read so far. I definitely think that probably Say You Swear is still my top ones, but Love in Other Words is definitely next out of stuff that I've read. But this is probably on a whole different bottom level of that compared to those, but it was not terrible. It's a cute read. I would recommend reading it, if you want a good, nice, happy go lucky story, but it just Not one of my favorites.
Okay. Well, so as always, if you liked this episode or any other one, please subscribe to get access to bloopers, extra content, and more on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Patreon, YouTube, and just about every other platform that you can listen to a podcast on.
You can also send us book suggestions, comments, or general inquiries to our email at likewereadthem at karlempodcast.com, which I realize I have not specified that Karl is spelled with a K and not a C. So just in case you've tried to email us and it's not gone through. You can also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. We can't wait to hear your guys' thoughts. We do have those discussions on Mondays, so feel free to join in on them. And also we have discussions under each of our posts about each of our episodes. If you guys have anything you want to talk about, or you can just private message us, that's fine too. So yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to the end of this episode. And next week, we'll be discussing Twilight by Stephanie Myers.
I am not going to get mine because mine is falling apart.
Just the short little blurb. So, about 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. I'm blushing just thinking about it. I can't wait till we talk about this book.
I'm really excited. I'm also kind of worried that it's not going to be as good as what I remembered it because it's been like 10 years since I read it for the last
Same.
time. So I'm really nervous, but I'm really excited to like be able to dissect it. And I'm hoping that I can just be like, okay, well, I've read it 58 times, so I can really still put myself in that perspective of whenever I read it for the first 58 times.
Yes,
So,
fingers crossed. But as always, we promise to Carl them like we read them.
theme song.